So today we're going to talk about cost advantage, and this should give you an opportunity as we go through. Feel free to ask questions. This is a chance for you to, as you try and really sort of absorb the material we've gone through over the last, couple of weeks. The days that we don't do a case where we do a where there's sort of a lecture discussion, is an opportunity for you to be able to ask any questions that you have when trying to understand the material. So let's start with just a summary of the sources of cost advantage. So if we were going to do like a logic tree, and what drives cost advantage, there are these 5 things that I would point to as one way to organize that logic tree as to why companies have a cost advantage. It's because of economies of scale, because of learning and experience effects. That's interesting. Learning and experience effects, lower costs due to proprietary knowledge, lower input costs, or a different business model. All right, but one of the first things I want you to appreciate is sort of how you solve various different kinds of problems for a company, or how you address them by understanding how to do cost analysis. So I'm going to start with a mini case. And I think I have Parker. Is Parker here today? Parker, if you could, I'll give you the first crack at this mini case. All right? Pressure's on. All right, pressure's on. So Fry's Electronic Bank does store credit cards for Fry's Electronics, or First Electronic Bank, excuse me. After a number of years, 25% of Fry's customer base have a Fry's credit card, but growth is slow. So should First Electronic Bank spend more money on marketing to increase penetration of the Fry's card? Should they spend money on marketing to get other store client customers to adopt a store card provided by First Electronic Bank? And what analysis would you recommend to FAB to determine what, if any, they should spend on marketing to get new customers?
So I remember the reading, I think, touched on this briefly, and they talked about the curve, essentially, as you gain market share, as you gain more penetration into Fry's, more customers, there's a cost advantage to that. So the question is, will the marketing, the extra cost, the extra money you spend on marketing, will that balance out with that cost advantage? And so there's a formula you can do for that. But I guess as I read that in the reading, I just thought, how can you be sure that an increased budget in your marketing campaign is going to, because I can say,
it's
okay,
going to bring in new customers.
Well, so far we've spent this much on marketing, this is what we've gained. And that's the best, I guess, data you have to support that claim. But what if you spend another 100%, increase your marketing budget by 100%, and you don't get the return on the gains that you hoped?
It's always a gamble, right? I mean, because any strategic decision you make, you're never quite sure what's going to happen. What you're trying to do is at least minimize the uncertainty by doing some analysis that will help you to sort of minimize that uncertainty. So, so you're sort of on track here, where you're trying to figure out what the value is of additional customers,
yeah,
and then what you can afford to spend on marketing.
Yeah.
So what specific analysis do you think you would do to figure out what is the value of those additional customers?
There's an equation that you run though with your experience curve, your scale.
Okay. Yeah, you're getting this is the motion's in the right direction. Yes.
I can't remember what it is.
Anybody else want to take a crack at this? Jared?
Okay, one thing you do is look at, as their market share has grown over the last number of years, what effect it's had on their cost, and
Cost in what way? How do you?
So as cost, so we look at, as market share has grown, what effect has that had on cost per unit for this First Electronic Bank with their cards?
And what's a unit?
Each additional credit card that they
issue?
Okay. For like a year time.
Okay, so you could do it at the credit card level. So, yeah.
So
go ahead.
In the beginning it says, so how much do your costs decrease as you for each new customer you serve? So you have all these fixed costs, right? You have like administrative costs for the bank and whatnot. And so you look, okay, if we're serving 1,000 customers with fries, how much does that cost us? As we increase that by 1, how much does that cost increase?
Okay. So as we think about this, this is sort of the cost per, you could think about it as a card or a subscriber, right? This is, what is our cost per customer, per subscriber, per card? Or you might even think about this as cost per transaction, if you wanted to take it down to the individual transaction, because some customers or subscribers may have more transactions than others, so you could look at how your cost per transaction is changing over time. And then you're looking here, what you're going to do is you're going to look at the total number of subscribers, right? So now I've got my total number of subscribers, and then I can just start plotting years, right? So I start, 1995 or whatever, and I plot the first year. What was my cost per subscriber, and what were the total number of subscribers? And to get my cost per subscriber, all I have to do is take my total cost, right? Divide that by total number of subscribers, and I've got my cost per subscriber. And I can do that each year. You can usually get that data off of an annual report. It's part of why I wanted you to do this assignment you did for today, to get a sense for how you can gather this data and actually analyze it from publicly available data. All right, so you plot year 1, you plot year 2, and you see what this looks like. And usually doesn't look that clean, but let's assume it does. You plot the best fit line, your regression line, and then that will tell you how much our costs decrease if we double our number of subscribers, right? We can now do it as sort of a scale curve and experience curve. So this now tells us how much our costs will decrease. Well, let's say I am here, and I'm trying to figure out whether or not to invest to grow my subscribers. Now I actually, if I think I can grow my subscribers, the question is how much can I grow my subscribers? But I think I can get down here. What that means is I can now look at my costs dropping from this to this per subscriber. I take that across all my subscribers, and I know that's the value of this many more customers here, because I've now been able to drop my cost per subscriber. I've added a certain number of additional subscribers. If it costs me more than that in marketing, then it probably doesn't make sense to do it. But if I think it'll cost me less than that in marketing, then it probably makes sense for me to make the investment. And the other thing you have to realize is that the marketing expense may be a one-year expense, or it may be a multiple-year expense to keep them. If it's only a one-year expense, you may want to spend the money to get the additional customers, but the nice thing is now this gets built in because you have more subscribers and your cost per subscriber is lower for everybody. Does that make sense? Yes.
Are there ever cost advantage curves that are linear shaped? Because the majority, my understanding is that more exponential. So.
Let me talk about the shape of cost curves in just a minute when we get through the presentation. All right, so let me move to, is Seth here? So Seth, when your team did your analysis in the wireless industry, what did your experience curve look like, or your scale curve look like?
So we did it for Verizon, AT&T, Sprint, and T-Mobile, so we have different curves
for different firms.
For different firms.
Okay, and you did it like this, cost per subscriber?
Yeah.
And which firm had based upon yours, had the sort of steepest experience curve slope?
We found that AT&T had
AT&T, and what was theirs?
with every doubling, their costs would decrease by about 34%.
Okay, and that was over a 7-year time period?
Correct.
So AT&T, basically, with every doubling, their costs drop by 34%. So that basically a 64-degree or experience curve slope. And which one had the flattest experience curve?
Sprint, 29%.
So Sprint was 29%. So, but even with Sprint, we're looking at a 71-degree slope.
Right.
So, did most of the others, did anybody else come up with something that was quite different than this? Okay,
Well, we see 21% for AT&T.
21% for AT&T.
Which seemed fairly reasonable.
Okay,
Numbers for Sprint were a little bit scattered because they had a goodwill impairment in the last 7 years that really threw off the numbers. And so I am taking all those things into account, threw out something like 47%, which obviously isn't too light, which is just a presentation of some of the problems that go into just looking at 7 years of data when markets are so volatile.
so you might want to do a longer
Yeah.
time period, because sometimes you have these sort of extraordinary items or things you're not quite sure what to deal with for that time period. Yeah.
Just a quick question for Seth's group. Do you use just their fixed costs, or do you use total expenses, or what do you use?
We used operating income and revenue, so just all the expenses that come into operating income. So we didn't use the below the line expenses.
Did you find that your numbers off the SEC or off their own website?
Yeah,
We had,
mostly
like,
SEC.
Okay. Yeah. So here's one of the things that you're going to learn is that the data. So you'll get sent out to do a project, and you'll go grab some data, and it depends. You know, the analysis you do will depend on your data and whether or not the data is good, right? And you want to be able to justify your data, whether it's from the company, whether it's from the SEC. You may want to show it like with extraordinary items or outside so that you can see what it looks like both ways, so you do the sensitivity analysis. Yes, Bridget?
And is it inappropriate when you're doing the analysis to like leave out some outliers? Like I know a couple of companies had one big outlier either below or above. And so our group, we felt it was more accurate to leave that out of our analysis of the curve.
Yeah, so these are judgment calls, right? Because if you feel like for some reason something happened in a given year that's not actually reflective of what you would sort of expect on an ongoing basis, perfectly appropriate to highlight this. We thought this was an outlier, so we removed it from the regression equation. Yeah, absolutely. What were so give me any other group, what did you have for?
So with AT&T, we did specifically segmented operating costs for AT&T, and we ended up with a 9.8%. When you double, so when you double, you get 9.8%
Drop in.
decrease in costs.
Okay, so that means you're looking at a 91% or 91-degree slope,
Yeah.
or about 90.
Yeah, it's like 90.2.
And you had the same? We had the same too. And you had the same too. So obviously you're including costs that somehow Seth's group and some other groups were not including. And the question then would be, if we were trying to reconcile, what were the costs that were being included, that you had included, that were not included over here? Yes?
Yeah, just like we noticed that with this 7-year time span, there was a lot of, and I think it was probably because of the introduction of the iPhone, a lot of the data was kind of messed up. And so we actually threw out one of the years for AT&T, because between 2006 and 2007, I think their cost literally doubled. And that was the same year that the iPhone came out, and I imagine they spent like a ton of money on infrastructure. So we didn't think that was really representative of kind of their progression as a company.
So if you throw them out altogether,
So if you keep
so this is based upon eliminating a year that you thought was an outlier.
Yeah, and a year pre-iPhone and they're post-iPhone now, so we thought that was appropriate. And so yeah, if you keep that year in, it significantly lowers their curve,
Okay.
flattens it.
Yes.
And wouldn't everyone's numbers be a lot different depending on which 7 years they chose?
Yeah.
Absolutely, absolutely. I'm assuming most of you tried to pick like the most recent 7 years. Did anybody pick a different 7-year time period? Yes.
Every 2000, 2008.
Okay, so you went like up to where the iPhone would have been introduced for AT&T. Okay. We'll do a case later in the class on the AT&T and Apple alliance. and sort of look at what they were both trying to achieve in that alliance and whether or not it turned out for both of them. Yeah.
So in this analysis, we had a discussion about whether or not the value we're really looking at is fixed cost per part or fixed cost per subscriber, and then variable cost per subscriber is kind of a different thing. You'd expect at least some based on the reading, a small decrease in variable cost, but the real advantage comes from the fixed cost.
It does tend to come from the fixed cost, but what you want to do with this is you want to include both all fixed costs and all variable costs. Because what you're trying to get a sense for is if we could actually double our subscribers, how much would our fixed and variable costs decrease with that doubling of subscribers? Okay, so can you, when you see these kinds of steep experience curve slopes, can you understand why there's been such consolidation in this business? So there used to be a lot more cell phone companies in the past. Now what's interesting is we've seen this consolidation down to what you might think of as the big four, right, of Sprint and AT&T and Verizon and T-Mobile. We're now also starting to see Walmart, and we're starting to see some other sort of less expensive options emerge more locally. But for the most part, we've seen this very dramatic reduction in the number of players because the cost per subscriber goes down so much if you can double your subscribers. Because once you've built out that network, once you've made that huge investment, now it's largely fixed cost, or a large percentage of it is fixed cost, and so you want to maximize the number of subscribers. And now what we're seeing is some of these regional players are actually just tapping into these networks because they're trying to sell off some of the sort of excess capacity that they have to other players so that they are getting paid something for some of the capacity that's not getting used. All right, so if we think about this case with First Electronic Bank, what you're trying to understand is how important is volume, is increased volume as a driver of my cost. The more increased volume as a driver of my costs, the more I can invest, the more I should be willing to invest in order to increase my volumes, right? So then, if First Electronic Bank finds that if they can double their number of subscribers and their costs drop by 20% to the 80%, 80-degree slope, then they now can sort of estimate, here's how much it's worth to spend on marketing to get new customers. Yes?
So if there's a contracting trend within a company, does this process go backwards? Like if a company's in trouble and you're trying to figure out a way to turn it around, are we looking at that as well? Like this scale curve is saying your costs are increasing.
Your costs are going
as you lose subscribers, basically.
Yes, your cost per subscriber is going to increase, and you're going to want to try and see, is there any way that we can get rid of some of our fixed costs?
Okay.
Because otherwise, what's going to happen is we're going to become in a worse and worse cost position.
So if you were looking at the possibility of saying, yeah, we're going to increase our price, this will lower our customer base, but we will in the end generate more revenue. Would this process of looking at their data kind of allow us to see how much our costs would actually rise with the increase of revenue?
Absolutely. And the goal is just to make sure that you're smart about your business, that you know what happens when we increase customers. How much more money are we likely to make? If we lose customers, in an economic downturn, let's say we lose customers, how much is that going to affect our cost per customer or our cost per unit? So that then you can hopefully make smart decisions about how to make sure. This is one of the reasons why Southwest wanted to grow slowly and in a controlled way. Because what they learned was that when you have lots of planes and you have an economic downturn, this actually hurts your profitability. And they didn't want to have to lay people off. They wanted to maintain this certain kind of culture where people felt like they had stable employment, which was very unlike many of the other airlines that had lots of layoffs. And so these influence the choices that you make around how quickly we grow and how much investment we make to try and get new customers. So you're trying to answer this question: how important is size or volume as a driver of profitability? To understand that, you have to be able to know how to do experience curve analysis and scale curve analysis, or a market share profitability analysis. So let's just talk about economies of scale for a moment. So economies of scale is taking for given years cost per unit of production and volume of production for a given year. And what we tend to find is that over time it drops, but at some point manufacturing plants become so large and so complex that actually the costs start to go back up. They become very hard to manage. You have to draw workers from a larger area, you have to pay more wages, that in fact at some point your plant can become too big and your costs will actually start to go up. The place where this curve starts to flatten out is what we often think of as the minimum efficient scale. So this is the minimum volume we need to produce in order to be pretty much at the lowest cost possible. And that's where you typically want to produce, is wherever your minimum efficient scale is for in any sort of production facility. All right, so you're getting economies of scale. Here's your minimum efficient scale where it's flattening out, and that's where you tend to want to produce, and of course then you can get this economies of scale.
So
Yes.
if you were looking at this curve, where, like, it's not the minimum point on that curve, is that correct? Is that what you just said? It's when it's starting to flatten out pretty much.
It's when it's
about the
starting to
same?
flatten, yeah.
So how do you?
It's where it's starting to flatten out. So it actually could be maybe even slightly lower, but not significantly along here, out here, but you typically want to produce closer to the minimum. You'd rather have more places where you're producing because it gives you flexibility. And so it reduces certain risks by having more units as opposed to everything sort of in one plant. That makes sense? Okay. Any other questions about how this works? All right. So why do economies of scale lower costs? Okay. Well, two main reasons. One is the ability to spread fixed costs, property, plant, and equipment. But also you have non-production costs like research and development. Right? Once you've made that investment to develop that new drug, if you only sell in the United States, you can only spread your R&D costs over a US population. Whereas you'd rather spread it across a global population, right? So a lot of times those costs really become fixed costs. And then the second reason that your costs go down with economies of scale is specialization. So you now can have specialized machines and equipment that are designed for a specific task instead of maybe using labor. Or you can have people who now specialize on how to do a particular task and they get really good at it. And it's just the whole notion of practice makes perfect. The more people who can do the same task over and over, the better they'll get it. And that's why costs go down with economies of scale. We see this in a lot of different industries. I just wanted to note that what you can do is you can actually do this for specific kinds of costs in a company. So you could do it for advertising. You could do it for marketing. Let's see how it works for research and development. We could pick a variety of different costs and look at how the costs per, in this case, per case of soft drinks sold goes down as we increase the annual sales volume of cases. And what you see here with Pepsi and Coke is that, yeah, they're spending a ton of money. It looks like 230 million looks like a lot of money. It is a lot of money. But when you actually look at the cost per case relative to some of the competitors, they're actually spending less per case because of the volumes that they're generating. So they're able to get, you know, that brand awareness, but they're able to get it at a relatively low cost per unit that's out there. This is an example of a credit card company scale curve. So, and what you see, I'm going to show this on another one. You saw this with the Intel case. Is you often actually see sort of a rolling pattern with scalar experience curves. Why do you think that happens?
Sorry, going back to the last slide where we're talking about advertising on the left. Since it's a non-tangible thing and we're not talking about workers or plant or getting too big of a factory, could they experience diseconomies of scale as well if we produce too much, I'm guessing? Is there a point when you hit it, you know, you just want to say, okay, we're not going to advertise anymore? Or is it more like that's only for tangible things?
That's a really good question. The question is, it really gets at to the diminishing returns to advertising, right? Is there a point at which you could advertise, in fact, and it won't help you at all? In fact, it will hurt you. It's like people look at it and say, I am so sick of seeing their advertisements, I don't want to even see another one. I'm not going to use their product because I don't want to see this advertisement. Right? And sometimes you might have seen some advertisements go over and over again, and you're like, why do they keep doing these? You know, so it could be they actually could turn customers off. So I think there are definitely diminishing returns. I think there are probably some sophisticated ways that marketers and advertisers probably use to figure out what are the diminishing returns, at what point are people saturated. But I can't give you any sophisticated guidance on that.
Okay.
All right, so so we often see this sort of rolling pattern. In fact, let me see if we've got, I think this here as well. You remember the Intel case experience curves that you did? They probably look like this. Any idea why you have this rolling pattern? Pardon?
I would assume that as you increase in volume, you have periods of expansion along the way, right? So, all right, we get to 50,000 or however many units. From here, we have to invest in a larger factory. We have to invest in more equipment or whatever it might be. So you see those little spikes, and then you continue to curve down.
Yeah, so at some point along the way, you usually have to make some larger fixed cost investments to service that sort of next group of customers. And it could be related to, you know, it's often related to sort of plant equipment that are needed for production. So you tend to see it more in manufacturing industries than others, but not, you know, not necessarily. It's just maybe there's a big marketing push that needs to occur every once in a while to pull in more customers. Or maybe you invest more in R&D for certain periods. Yes?
How do you know when it is just a lip and when it is actually that bottom, that minimum? Because if you zoom in, it kind of looks like
good point.
You get the swoop.
You could get to here and you could think, geez, maybe we're not, you know, maybe it doesn't matter anymore.
Yeah.
And
a second wave, and there could be a third wave.
And I don't know of any way to give you guidance on that. The assumption is, you know, that that costs just generally continue to go down this curve. But there are, you know, there are some points when you think that once we've produced enough of these units, we're probably not going to continue to reduce the cost per unit much longer. So all I can say is that if it's a very mature product and it's been produced for a long time, then you're probably not going to see, you know, very, you know, great reductions in costs as you increase your volume. But it's a good question, and I think understanding your industry is something that can help. So let me go back here now to learning and experience curve effects. So technically, a learning curve is different from a scale curve. Learning curve originally was developed in the aircraft industry, where they looked at labor costs. So if you were thinking about this sort of graphic back here, this would be labor costs per unit, and it would look at cumulative production of units. Why is it a learning curve? Because we're looking at what happens to your labor costs where people are supposedly learning how to do this job. How much do your labor costs go down as you increase volume? So a learning curve technically is defined as just your labor costs per unit and how that changes over time. Okay? When you start to put in scale, then you're putting in all your fixed costs. And the experience curve, you're looking at it over time with your fixed and variable costs. So when we think about an experience curve, the general notion is that companies are out selling similar kinds of products, and there's an industry price. And if they're producing the product in a similar way, they're all coming down an experience curve, and you've got firms A, B, and C. And we would expect that over time, C is probably going to be the most profitable company because they have the lowest cost per unit. And the law of experience means the variable and average, or variable plus fixed cost per unit, declined by a constant percentage, typically somewhere between 10 to 30% each time cumulative output doubles. That's sort of what you expect to have happen in most industries. Why does it work? Well, you get decreasing variable costs per unit because of things like bargaining power as you get bigger. But you also get increased learning, human learning. You have design and process improvements that you get. And you also get decreased fixed cost per unit because you can spread those fixed costs. Well, and you've already seen this for microprocessors, as an example. So there's this, the other way you can think about looking at the value of volume or market share is by doing what I have described as this sort of market share profitability graphic. So we expect that relative market share to be a proxy for experience or for volume, right? The more market share we have, the more volume you have. So we may not be able to do a cost per unit, but we would typically expect there to be a relationship so that profitability is going to go up as experience or relative cumulative experience or market share goes up. However, market share is not always the cause of high profitability. So I think we talked about that like the second or third day. It could be that, you know, Toyota has emerged over the last 30 years as the leader in automobiles, not because market share drove profitability, but because high quality drove both market share and profitability at the same time. Sometimes there's a third variable, something that isn't on this chart that could be driving both. So just be aware of it. But at least it gives you a sense for whether or not being big is likely to be an important driver of success in a particular industry. That's why I wanted to have you do it for the airline industry. Because once you do that graphic, you realize, oh, okay, being big isn't critical for being successful in this industry. That's helpful to know. Yes?
What about companies like Walmart who are big, they have large market share, but they only make like, let's say like $1 or whatever on every product? Would you consider them to have low profitability but high revenues? Or what would you say about
So the profit you have to look at is the return on assets or the return on capital. So they get very slim margins, but because their volumes are so huge, they actually make a decent return on assets or capital that's employed in the business. So let me give you an example. This is actually from the home improvement. If we think about sort of the home improvement retailing, we've got Home Depot, Lowe's, and then this is an estimate for Walmart that was developed based upon some data, but we don't know for sure how costs are allocated at Walmart. So this could be quite a bit higher. And then you got Sears, True Value, and Ace. And clearly what you see here suggests that if you're going to succeed in home improvement, you're better off if you're Home Depot or your Lowe's, that you're a big player. Although you see that Home Depot is quite a bit bigger at the time, but not a lot more profitable. But at least if you do this kind of chart, it gives you a sense of whether or not being big really makes a difference to success in a particular industry. Yes?
Clarifying, this is profitability per unit?
This is net profit margin, which is as a percentage of sales. So the way you do it, you typically do these as a percentage of sales. The best measure is operating income divided by your revenues. Because that's what you're generating. Your operating income is the profit you're generating from your operations, and you're dividing that by your revenues. And then sometimes you'll have funny things with financing and your taxation and stuff that comes down to your net income. So typically in strategy, we like to look at operating income divided by revenues as the measure of profitability and success. So you're going to always see this on a percentage basis over here. Because it's right, it's possible Walmart, because of lower prices, may only make 1% margins, but when you divide that by the assets they have employed or the revenues that they actually are much more profitable than the competition. You typically prefer to do a return on assets. So what do we learn from this? There are some strategic implications for managing business from doing this kind of analysis, experience curve or scale curve analysis. Number one, it helps you for growth and investment strategy. The slogan or the saying to be number one or number two in your industry, which came from General Electric years ago, Jack Welch said, we're going to be number one or number two, or we're just not going to be in there. It comes from GE competing in a lot of businesses that had steep experience curves. Because if you were not number one or number two in a steep experience curve business, you're not going to make much money. If you're not a leader in microprocessors, you're not going to make money. Now, that's not true in airlines, but in microprocessors, it's true. In GE, in the engine business, it's true. In their appliance business, it's true. In their lighting business, it's true. So in the businesses that they were in with relatively steep experience curves, it's like, if it's a steep experience curve, you better get big fast or get out. That's sort of the implication. All right. It also helps you with pricing strategy. If you know how fast costs come down as units increase, you can now price for future profits. You can say, oh, well, we can price maybe even at our cost today, because we know if we price at our cost and we drive more volume, that our costs will be 20% lower than this. Let's say if we can double our volume over the next year or whatever time period. You may choose not to do that, but at least if you understand how costs are going down, you can use it for pricing contract or just pricing decisions in the marketplace. Yes?
Are there companies that, given an experience curve, that they'll go and receive a lower cost, therefore they'll become more aggressive in their pricing, try to bleed out of the competitors?
So in almost every case, you will find that price experience curves follow cost experience curves. Which means one way to figure out how fast costs are coming down in an industry is you actually go and look at prices in the marketplace and look at how quickly prices come down, and usually that will track with costs.
So they won't seek higher margins, they'll seek to bleed out everybody else.
Yeah. And when I was doing work at Bain & Company, one of the ways, if we couldn't get cost per unit, we would go look at price experience curves. And that would give us a sense. In fact, you'll see the Harley-Davidson case, you're going to see some price experience curves for motorcycles. So you look at how the price per cc has sort of gone down over time. Yeah. And you use that as a proxy. You think, well, if the prices are coming down that fast, that's probably roughly how fast their costs are coming down. Yes?
So just to apply what you just said to the oil industry, with North Dakota and the lowering cost of oil in the United States, why is it the prices are still pretty, I mean, it seems like they're not dropping as fast as you would expect costs to be dropping.
So what you always have to make sure you do, and I'm glad you raised this question, is you always have to make sure when you're doing any sort of experience curve or scale curve, you always have to make sure you do it in constant dollars. Because what happens if you don't do it in constant dollars, and you can look at Southwest's cost per passenger over time. If you look at it, it actually looks flat. It doesn't look like their costs per passenger have gone down. But when you factor in inflation, in fact, their costs are going down about 3%. If you can keep it flat, and with inflation, with costs typically at about 3%, in fact, your costs are going down each year if you could just keep your costs flat instead of going up with inflation 3% each year. So you always have to make sure that you're doing those curves based upon a constant dollars. So it may look like oil prices just continue to go up, and they have, but the question is, have they gone up a lot more with inflation, or haven't they? And oil is a little bit unusual because it depends upon sort of reserves and whether you strike oil. This is not like you're producing oil in just a factory and you can produce more, because the raw materials, there's a limited supply. So I don't know that it would necessarily follow what we would think of as a typical experience curve. All right, it can also help you with benchmarking or cost analysis. So scale curves can be plotted for your company, and you could plot it for a competitor, and then you can see, are we doing a good job in terms of our managing costs, or are we doing a bad job? When you look at the auto industry, General Motors, for example, we had all of them sort of going through bankruptcy, 3, 4, 5 years ago. Well, what happened is GM had high market share, but they didn't have high profits. Their costs were high. And a lot of it had to do with their union labors, the fact that they had very high medical costs and pensions. And they had sort of spent a lot of money on plant and equipment over the past, and they weren't able to keep the volumes going because people weren't buying GM cars as much as they needed them to. And so they ended up needing to restructure and pulling back their volume, their total volumes, because they simply weren't able to sell them in the marketplace. They just had too much plant and equipment and too many workers. And the benchmarking analysis can help you figure that out. The last thing it can help you out with is it can help you with acquisition strategy. So you've all heard about synergies, right? You acquire a company, and there are going to be synergies. Who can tell me what is a synergy? Yeah.
It's like a mutual benefit for both companies.
Yeah, so it's somehow, it's this notion that 1 + 1 = 3, right? There's a synergy. But where does that actually come from? How do you get it? Yeah.
I mean, one example is if you have an e-commerce site, or two e-commerce sites paired together, that they can each have larger market share than their competitors because of the way that Google looks at, like, if you have two large entities that reference each other, then they get larger market share in Google's search engine.
Okay, so that may be one way. There may be a synergy on the marketing side, perhaps, with sort of cross-selling to customers. There could also be synergies on the cost side. It's like, well, we don't need 2 customer service areas. We can now cut one of them back by 50%, let's say. Or we don't need as many plants. We can actually close one of the plants because now we have some redundancy. So you're eliminating some of the redundancies. Let me give you an example. So here we have total operating costs per room per day is a measure of sort of cost per unit in the internet service provider business. So we've got Guest Tech, which is coming down this experience curve. This is their data right here. Then they acquire Golden Tree that has 200,000 rooms. So they jump from here out to here. Now the question is there any way they could predict what their costs will be after the acquisition? And the answer is, yeah. If you're calculating an experience curve and you look at how much your costs are coming down per unit, and then you say, okay, now if we jump from here to here, how much will our costs come down? Then when we do an acquisition, we can estimate what the synergies will come on the cost side per unit by putting our 2 operations together. Of course, what you tend to find, because of the integration costs, you'll tend to find you usually are going to have, you'll actually usually see a bump. This sort of goes over flat. But usually you'll see it, ride one of these, it's going to jump up for a little while before it starts to go back down because now you're trying to figure out how to put these together and there's often costs associated with integration. Yes?
When you're doing this type of forecasting, what numbers do you want to use? Do you want to look at, okay, here's the experience curve for the industry as a whole, just for these specific companies?
You want to do it for those 2 companies. Okay. If you can do your company, because you want to know what your experience curve is, because you're assuming if you can bring things down at your same rate, yours is the more important than even your competitors.
Right.
Because you're the one that's managing that and using certain technologies to get those kinds of reductions with increased unit volume. So yours is the most important, but you also want to look at yours and your competitors.
What about for new
entrants you're
into an industry, wanting to look at, okay, this is the type of cost advantage we're going to experience as we reach output X, Y, and Z. Do you want to look at industry average? Do you want to look at specific potential?
You want to look at who do you think you are. Usually new entrants benefit from spillovers. That you've hired people away that have already worked at another company perhaps. So you're assuming that we're maybe starting in a better position because we've been able to observe how others do it. And we may even think we could have improved certain things. We just don't have the volume yet.
Right.
So you want to look at whichever competitor you think you're going to be the closest to in terms of the way you produce your product or service.
Okay.
And then that would be your best estimate of what it's likely to be for your firm. Okay. And what we saw from Guest Tech when they actually acquired Golden Tree is that because they were able to because they were in the same business, they were direct competitors. One benefit from acquiring a direct competitor is now you don't have to compete with them, right? So there's less pressure on the pricing side. But also now you get to bring your costs together, and you can eliminate redundancies in the cost, and hopefully it allows you to keep going down the experience curve, and that's why Guest Tech was able to have record profits after that acquisition and after they integrated it. All right, I want to highlight some limitations of the experience curve. Market share does not guarantee substantial cost advantages. Because there's this question, what's the cost of market share? What do you have to spend to get it? And the learning curve flattens with high experience. So The next thing is spillovers of knowledge to rivals lower their cost of learning, and aging equipment can also impede, continuing to get lower cost reductions. Sometimes your equipment just becomes obsolete. A new entrant can come in with sort of newer, more advanced equipment and lower their costs. So we talked about this a little bit yesterday, so I don't want to, when we talked about Southwest, I don't want to spend much time on it. Just remember there are disadvantages of scale when you get a downturn. Now you've got a lot of fixed assets that you can't spread across as many customers. So firms with heavy fixed assets can respond to this by, one, you try to shift more of your cost structure from a fixed cost to a variable cost. That means there's less leverage, so it's less good in an upturn, but it's better in a downturn. A variable cost means let's outsource it to another company. That way if our costs go down, we just don't buy as much. Whereas if we have our own plant and equipment and our labor, and our volumes go down, then we still have to pay for that regardless. So that's what I mean by shifting it to variable cost. Another way is to try and be in different kinds of businesses that might have different cyclicality. And that's one of the real benefits to General Electric, because they're in a lot of different businesses, that some, lighting sort of maybe goes with the economy, financial services sort of goes with the economy. Medical equipment, people sort of need medical equipment in good and bad times. When you have those sort of businesses in your portfolio, it helps smooth the ups and the downs, and so you're much more predictable, and that lowers your cost of capital. All right. And we saw this in the airline industry, as you may recall last time, is that from the 2002 to the 2006 time period, actually, if you were bigger, if you had more sort of greater market share, more airline seat miles flown, you actually were less profitable during that downturn time period. All right. So let's move on and talk a little bit about other ways you can have low cost. So another way is that you develop some proprietary knowledge about how to produce a product or a service that others just can't figure out very easily. And we sort of mentioned this last time with Southwest, and I showed you that graphic about the Toyota production system. And they just have a variety of key principles, and it's been really successful over time because it's really hard to imitate. It's hard to have somebody who understands how the whole thing works and be able to put it together and make it work and get it to work with your suppliers as well. So the more you can learn something that's valuable and keep it proprietary, the better off you are. So you don't want others to know how you do it. I know Amazon is a company that's been very successful. When I've done interviews with folks at Amazon, they almost always have somebody from public relations on the phone during the interview, because they don't want those folks sharing or telling anything that they think might be proprietary to the way they win. So, so the folks getting interviewed tend to be pretty careful about their selection of words and what they're going to share. And I've been pretty fortunate to get some interesting information, but I know there are times when it's like, no, we're not going to talk about that. We're not going to tell you how we do that. Let's go talk about lower input costs. So if we think about why do you get lower input costs, there tend to be 3 or 4 main reasons. Number one is it's bargaining power story. It's a volume story. Volume really does matter. Or it could be not a volume story. If you look at, for example, Toyota's costs of their inputs from suppliers, or Honda's, they have historically been lower than those that GM or Ford got, even though GM and Ford were bigger and in theory had more bargaining power over their suppliers. But it was because of the way they worked with their suppliers in a cooperative fashion that they figured out ways that they could mutually lower costs together. So I think I mentioned the supplier that built, a Toyota supplier that built the conveyor belt that took the seats from their plant into the Toyota plant. Well, that really saves a lot of costs in terms of inventory, as opposed to building your seats 500 miles away and putting them in a truck and shipping them there. That's one way that you lower costs through better cooperation. And then you could be just sourcing from low-cost locations. We'll do a Nike case in not too long where we'll look at how their sourcing strategy has been an important part of their success by being the first to really aggressively source their shoes in Asia and trying to get the lowest cost labor possible. And then finally, you might have lower costs because you just have preferred access to those inputs. And that's what De Beers does by owning the diamond mines. Is they find the key raw materials, the diamond mines, that they buy them, then they own them, and then they can get them at lower cost. Finally, different business model. We'll talk more about business models later in the semester, and sort of really innovative strategies built on different business models, which are different activity sets. But it could be you reconfigure the value chain. It's often to eliminate activities or steps in the value chain. In some cases, it might be to eliminate stores. So if we think about Amazon versus Barnes & Noble and Borders, the way they've been successful in books, it was really a very different business model. It was selling over the internet as opposed to through stores. And Dell, for years, didn't sell through stores either. It was all, you ordered it, customized, delivered to your doorstep. All right, so now you have sort of this high-level summary of the different ways that a company can generate cost advantage. And it can come from a variety of different sources. Sometimes it is from scale and experience, but sometimes it's from lower cost inputs or proprietary knowledge of how to do something. The key is, of course, once you figure out a way to do something at less, you're trying to figure out how do we make sure that others can't figure out how to do it like we do, right? Because you're trying to create them the barriers to innovation. Any questions? All right, if not, we'll see you. I sent a slightly revised Harley-Davidson case, so we will talk about Harley-Davidson and we'll talk about differentiation of opinions.